As a semi-open world action-adventure RPG, Risen 3 can be pretty entertaining in some ways, especially if you're a fan of this developer's previous games and have a high tolerance for sometimes janky gameplay, but it does have some notable problems that I feel stem largely from its completely non-linear main quest line and the way the world was structured to accommodate its story. In contrast to many previous Piranha Bytes games, the entire world and practically all of the main quests are available to you from the very start of the game, after you complete a brief introduction sequence. Although it does still use sequential chapter drops to separate major chunks of the so-called story, the actual chapter placements are somewhat arbitrary and don't correspond with an actual plot line. They just sort of appear at sporadic intervals throughout your playthrough as you gain different progress levels towards completing all of your main quest objectives. The intention behind this is to allow for complete non-linear freedom, to go anywhere you want at the start of the game and focus on any objective you want. But this one design element has a major consequence on several key aspects of the game design that I feel actually make it worse than if they'd used a more linear main quest line with more structured world progression. These issues deal largely with a meandering storyline that takes forever for anything to really happen, without any sort of compelling hook to kick off the adventure, and then when things do start to happen the main questline is practically over, and issues balancing the game's overall progression, since each island has to be doable in a non-linear order, with no apparent way to make later islands more difficult, thus ensuring that each island follows a similar pattern in terms of how you progress through it, with you fighting the same kinds of enemy difficulties in the same order on every island. The end result is a game that often feels repetitive and stagnant, with you just sequentially going through the motions checking things off a list to completion, with little to no excitement or dynamic content as the game progresses for it to build towards a satisfying resolution. So I started brainstorming if it was possible to make Risen 3 into a more enjoyable experience by changing its main quest structure and how you advance through the game, while trying to keep the overall content that's already in the game largely the same, basically just rearranging everything in a different order with a few tweaks here and there. Some concepts would need to be expanded, of course, but I think there's room in my theoretical budget to just scale back on some of the more repetitive and bloated aspects to focus more effort into the more important areas. And while we're at it, I could address a few of the game's other shortcomings too, like the complete lack of a proper ending, underutilized characters, wasted potential, and more that could all be fixed with some simple rewrites. One thing I want to change right off the bat is tying Risen 3 into the previous games more closely, since I always felt like the central premise of Necroloth and his undead minions had no real connection to the core idea of Titans rising up and threatening to destroy the world, and he didn't really feel like a Titan Lord, which is the angle that Risen 2 pivoted into. He always felt like just a random new arch-villain with an unrelated plan that the writers just claimed to be a Titan Lord and slapped the subtitle Titan Lords onto the game in a weak attempt to act like a continuation of the series. The easiest way to make this work is to say that Necroloth is neither a Titan Lord nor Titan, but instead one of the gods that created the world, whom humanity banished before the start of Risen 1. He could be like Beliar from Gothic and be a god of darkness and death or whatever, who's pissed off at being banished and is now turning the souls of the underworld against the real world and trying to find a way to manifest himself in physical form once again to enact his revenge. And since the plot no longer deals with Titan Lords, we can go ahead and change the subtitle to something more appropriate, like Forsaken Gods or something. We'll just take that one back from Gothic 3 and pretend that never happened. And as long as we're retconning things, we can also say that Necroloth is the one who unleashed the power of the Titans, and that by defeating him, we'll also end the Titan threat and the war of the Titan Lords in the process, thus restoring some sense of stability to the world. I'm not really satisfied with that solution since it still feels like something of a cop-out, but at least it would tie up all the loose ends and bring things full circle to a concept that was foreshadowed at the beginning of Risen 1 without having to radically alter the main questline or any of its actual story. It's basically just changing some of the backstory, which could be accomplished with a few sporadic lines of dialogue. Another thing I want to change is to make the main character the same guy from the previous two games. I've read that the change to a new character may have been because the original German voice actor was dealing with health problems and couldn't record for the third game. If that's true, then I understand and respect the decision, but for the sake of the story, I think it would have been better to maintain continuity between all three games. There was a lot of subtle character development between the nameless hero and Patty in the previous games, for instance, with them starting out as strangers in Risen 1 and developing a sort of endearing camaraderie by the end of that game, and then meeting back up in Risen 2 and developing coy hints of possible romantic feelings, all of which is completely gone in Risen 3 because you're now a completely different character altogether. So by keeping the main character the same from Risen 2 to Risen 3, there's room for that relationship to build further, or at least resolve as opposed to being dropped completely like it was in the original character's absence, which again could be accomplished by simply changing some of the dialogue at various stages of the game. There's also the game's difficulty curve, which isn't really much of a curve at all since the whole game is way too easy from the start and it never really introduces tougher enemies to the equation. It's actually possible to defeat endgame main quest bosses on your very first island with zero combat training while playing on the highest difficulty. That really shouldn't be happening in a Piranha Bytes game, and so I would want to adjust the difficulty tiers of all enemies to make everything universally more difficult across the board, but also stagger the tiers out so we can introduce more difficult enemies in later chapters. I'll also be changing the game's central island hopping system into a more consolidated series of islands that you do in a more sequential fashion, with occasional options for nonlinear branching, which would help balance the enemy stats since the game can always know where the player has possibly been previously and where you'll be going next, with finite amounts of experience and skill training up until those points, due to non-respawning enemies and only so many quests to complete, to set maximum possible power levels a player could have reached in each chapter of the game. Tying weapon use to specific stat requirements would likewise help in limiting the player's total power while also making the scaling damage values as the player increases in strength more predictable with regards to setting corresponding enemy stats. One more thing I would want to change, which I forgot in my original draft of this video, is to tie faction abilities to chapter progression, kind of like how magic circles were handled in the Gothic games, so that you can't unlock all of your skills so soon after joining a faction and then spend so much of the game capped out with the same abilities. This would help with the progression by giving you more active abilities to look forward to in later chapters, so that the gameplay can feel like it's consistently evolving over your playthrough, while also giving you more opportunity for some of those more situational skills to feel useful. I figure once you join a faction at their lowest rank, you'd get their starting armor and maybe only your basic melee fist spell, heal spell, and one or two of their utility spells. In a later chapter, after doing enough tasks in the main quest, you'd get the chance to rank up and get tier 2 faction armor and abilities, which might then include some of the more offensive spells like the various knockback abilities and basic summon skills, plus another utility spell or two. Then before leaving for the final island, you'd achieve max rank for max armor and abilities, finally unlocking your ultimate skill like Rain of Fire or Necromancy or Summon Guardian, plus any remaining ones. It would also be nice to modify the basic fist spells to give them an upgrade path similar to Risen 1, which would likewise be tied to faction rank and thus chapter progression. Perhaps they could start with only allowing you to use the melee ability by itself, and then later you could upgrade it to add the ranged attack, charge attacks, faster attack speed, extra hit, and so on. While we're at it, it might be nice to balance these spells a little better by giving them some kind of cooldown, like all the other spells have, because it's pretty overpowered to be able to spam infinite attacks with no mana limit. Maybe they would have charge limits similar to ammo for ranged weapons, where you could cast a certain amount of times before needing to wait for the spell to recharge, or start recharging it prematurely by pressing the reload button, which would then put the ability into a cooldown period. Then as you rank up, you could learn new abilities that increase the total number of charges or reduce the cooldown period. These changes would be more drastic than simply rearranging the existing points when you can learn your faction abilities, so it's maybe not a practical solution for my theoretical budget, but it's still fun to think about in theory. Finally, there's the matter of the game's soul system, which acts like a karma meter representing how your soul is teetering between your humanity and the underworld, which the game does barely anything with to make it impactful. It would be nice if the soul system could be expanded in some way to reflect more meaningful gameplay changes, like with your soul rating influencing some of your dialogue options and quest solutions, or with one stage of the main quest having 3 branching paths for how you go about resolving a particular task. But that may be extending beyond the scope of how the soul function actually works in-game and may be more work than my theoretical budget would allow for. At a minimum, it would be nice for the ending cutscenes to actually imply different outcomes for your character and the world's fate, like they do at the end of Elix, in a more significant way than they actually do in Risen 3, which is to say, hardly at all. There are still plenty of other things that would need to be addressed to make Risen 3 as good as it could have been, like completely overhauling the melee combat system to make it more actively engaging, adding more dynamic movesets and abilities to the melee combat as you level up, reworking the faction abilities to make them more uniquely differentiated, with more ways to progressively upgrade your abilities as you advance in rank, cutting out some of the obnoxious invisible walls and putting more meaningful loot and Easter eggs in these kinds of areas, fixing the climb, jump, and falling physics to be more consistent and less frustrating, fleshing out the crew member system with more developed personal quests and affinity meters, which were only sort of teased in the actual game, making the sea battles feel a little less like gimmicky mini-games and expanding them into something more substantial, and other things like that. but those would be yet more significant changes to the gameplay than I think my theoretical budget would allow for, and really, I'm just trying to see how I can improve the game while changing it as little as possible, by just rearranging the parts that are already there and tweaking a few things. So I'm going to leave all of that as it is for this theoretical mock-up. With those preliminary subjects out of the way, here's a brief outline of how I could envision Risen 3 playing out in a way that I would find much more satisfying from a narrative standpoint as well as a gameplay standpoint. Note that Risen 3 was originally only 4 chapters long and involved exploring the Crab Coast in Chapter 1 and losing your soul, joining a faction and talking to a spiritual leader in Chapter 2, preparing for the ritual and completing it to try to restore your soul in Chapter 3, and then preparing to battle Necroloth on Skull Island in Chapter 4. Apart from the more linear quest path in Chapter 1 on the Crab Coast, the rest of the game is completely non-linear, with you sailing to all 8 of its islands in whatever order to work on all of your other objectives, like defeating Shadow Lords, closing crystal portals, gaining the trust of each of the faction leaders, and recruiting allied ships in the process. My treatment would expand the game into 6 chapters, similar to the original Gothic games, by basically moving some of those other objectives to later in the main quest and making them a more dynamic, exciting focal point, with the idea of more meaningful changes happening to familiar areas as you move into new chapters, and an enemy progression that properly ramps things up towards the conclusion. Chapter 1 can stay largely the same as it already is, but mainly I just want to change its beginning and end. The opening dream sequence with Crow is pretty much pointless and contributes nothing to the overarching story, and there's basically no exposition for anything at any point during the game's entire first chapter, which is what I really want to correct. So let's cut Crow out of the intro completely and start with a voiceover from, say, Eldrick, narrating some of the backstory of the previous Risen games and emphasizing the journey that the protagonist and Patty have been on until this point to give us a quick refresher on things and set the stage for the little adventure they're about to go on. Then cut to establishing shots of the ship approaching the Crab Coast, and then to Nameless and Patty on the deck of the ship talking about why they're there and what they're trying to accomplish. How about instead of them looking for generic pirate treasure for no reason, they found out there's a way they can permanently resurrect Captain Steelbeard, Patty's father, whose spirit has been saved in the Skull Staff since Risen 2, if they bring the staff to this special location and conduct a ritual with a special spell scroll they've already obtained. Then we cut to Necroloth's POV, who's spying on the ship approaching, where he can make some comment that alludes to wanting the player's soul or whatever to tease that there is some intriguing danger on this island before we set out on the adventure. The Crab Coast can then continue as normal, just with slight rephrasing of some of the encounters you run into along the way, so that they make more sense in the new context of not racing other pirates for treasure, but of this being some mystical island reputed for arcane sorceries. You eventually get to the ritual site, and after starting the ritual, the Skull Cave appears, followed by the Crystal Portal, from which Necroloth himself emerges, who attacks you and takes your soul. This is basically taking the anticlimactic twist reveal from the end of Chapter 3 and putting it at the beginning of the game so we can establish an actual premise with a more meaningful upfront hook that doesn't rely on so many unbelievably convoluted contrivances to work. Necroloth can reveal through a brief bit of dialogue that he set a trap at this mythical ritual site, and it's just unfortunate happenstance that you and Patty were the ones who triggered it. Now he has your soul, which he's using to give himself physical presence in the real world as he goes about his plan to unleash his undead horde on the world. This gives you personal stakes in the plot because you've been personally wronged by the bad guy at the start of the game instead of just some generic Shadow Lord minion, and it's your fault he's been unleashed on the world, so you feel more personal responsibility for setting things right. Necroloth believes you to be dead and scuttles off to do his evil bad guy stuff off screen, but this gives Patty a chance to continue with the ritual that you were there to perform in the first place, with the choice to resurrect the player instead of her father. Maybe she had to use the power of the Skull Staff to save what little bit of your soul was left in your body and the staff itself, thus permanently losing Steelbeard's soul binding in the process. She can play it coy by hinting at romantic feelings that have been developing over the previous 2 games for why she chose to resurrect you over her father, or just say that the world needs you more than she needs her father. So now a fractured remnant of your soul is being held in the Skull Staff, and as long as you have that, you can walk around normally, but if anything ever happens to the Skull Staff, you're toast. You keep the ship you had at the start of the game, since Patty is no longer sailing off after leaving your corpse buried on the Crab Coast. The rest of the story is about getting the rest of your soul back from Necroloth and stopping his evil plans. Chapter 2 can play out largely the same as it is in the actual game, with the primary goal being to join a faction so you can talk to a spiritual leader to get a suggestion about how to fully restore your soul. The big change I want to make here is cutting out all the extra islands that are unrelated to joining a faction, with the idea of restricting them until later chapters and setting this chapter on one large island that houses all 3 of the game's primary factions. I figure we can take Keela, Tyrannus, and Calidor and just sort of mash them together into one island, keeping them basically the same as they already are, just with some more neutral transitional areas between each region, sort of like they did with the different areas of Elix. Maybe also cut down the total size by about 33%, so it's not quite so big, and then we can use that extra 33% of production value elsewhere later in the game. This way you can have more direct interactions between factions, with NPCs escorting you from camp to camp, conflict over territory or resources, quests where one faction needs something from another, occasions when you need to pick one side over another for a particular quest, and so on. This would give the game a closer resemblance to the early Gothic and Risen games, and also would give it a larger, more open-world feel to the start of the game, versus the actual game's more disjointed, non-linear hub system. Enemies on this island can be a variety of difficulty levels placed around the map in typical Piranha Bytes fashion, but with an upper limit of what would ordinarily be considered mid-game enemies, so that we have the opportunity to introduce new, tougher enemies in later chapters to continue ratcheting the difficulty up towards the finale, and with higher stats so these enemies are more difficult to defeat in this chapter. Ideally, some of the toughest enemies present in Chapter 2 would be practically unbeatable until you come back in a later chapter after you've joined a faction and gained your new abilities, or else require extreme use of limited resources to defeat in Chapter 2, sort of like how it's possible to run into orcs or trolls in the beginning of Gothic 2, which can be defeated if you know exactly what you're doing and have the skill and patience to pull it off. This way you can experience a satisfying progression curve on this island with being initially challenged by everything and working your way up the food chain to take on the more difficult enemies by the end, without then being forced to go through that exact same sequence of enemy difficulties a second and third time on a second and third island, since it's now all happening as part of one singular island. This gets rid of some of the repetitive tedium of Risen 3's actual second chapter and still leaves lots of room for meaningful progression in later chapters as the stakes begin to rise towards the climax. Chapter 3 is where things start to branch out from the original game a little more. After joining a faction and talking to their spiritual leader, they point you in a direction towards recovering the lost fragments of your soul, which unlocks 3 new, smaller islands comparable in size and structure to Tacarigua, Antigua, and the unused landmass that was cut out from the main island in Chapter 2. They can theorize that Necroloth has your soul locked away somewhere and that he's using it as a battery to power his physical manifestation in the world. The quest objectives will therefore deal with tracking down where your soul's being held and needing to find MacGuffins to break Necroloth's containment spell. Maybe you need to track down bones or some other sort of special NPC on one island, or find a magic catalyst on another island, in addition to finding out where exactly your soul is being held on the third island and fighting your way past Necroloth's traps to reach it. To this end, each of the new islands would house one of these primary objectives and have a series of unique quests and character interactions that progressively build towards resolving your goal on that island, kind of like how each island in Risen 2 is dedicated to acquiring one of the Titan artifacts. 2 of the islands can have neutral towns with the Inquisition or Booze's old pirate gang, who will be part of the main quest on each island, while also giving you a few side quest opportunities in the process. And then the third island, where your soul is being held, can be a glorified dungeon where you have to navigate through complex level designs and solve puzzles and avoid traps to advance to your objective. Maybe there would be slight differences in the main quest in this chapter depending on which faction you chose, like if each faction would point you towards a different NPC you had to find and recruit to cast the spell, or if each one sent you to a different island initially to complete one of the 3 objectives first before you unlocked the other 2 to be done in whichever order. All the while you would, of course, have the opportunity to sail between any islands you've already unlocked, including returning to the main island to work on any side quests you may have left unfinished, or to visit merchants and skill trainers again. And if they're going to insist on having DLC islands, then I suppose you could work on them starting in this chapter as well, although this has the potential to throw the enemy balancing out of whack, which I'm not too fond of, so I would want these islands to have a minimal impact on the player's power creep if possible. Enemies in this chapter would consist of tougher variants of existing enemies you already fought on the previous island. For example, you'd run into dragon snappers instead of regular snappers, or golems instead of rock golems, and whatever else, with several new types of enemies like leviathans and grave spiders introduced to further elevate the maximum threshold of difficulty. The islands themselves can have similar distributions of enemies so that the first one you visit will effectively be the hardest, and then the last one will be the easiest, by virtue of having gained some more experience from the previous islands. But since these islands will be much smaller than the original 3 islands of Calidor, Aquila, and Tyrannus, it hopefully won't feel quite as repetitive or stagnant going through the motions 3 different times, especially since the one island with a dungeon would have a radically different gameplay focus to mix things up, and the other 2 would be focused so heavily around the main quest that you would feel more engaged by the main quest than any possible stagnation in the difficulty curve. Anyway, once you finally complete all 3 stages of the main quest in this chapter, you successfully recover the lost fragments of your soul, and then the game cuts to Chapter 4. In Chapter 4, you return to the main island from Chapter 2 and find that things have changed while you are retrieving your soul. Necroloth attacked the faction headquarters while you were away and captured their spiritual leaders, in the process opening new portals with shadow minions in a bunch of different places all over the island. So he no longer needed your soul anymore, since he now has 3 more, even better power sources, which will play into his plans for world domination, or whatever his evil bad guy plan is. The main quest in this chapter is to bring stability to the 3 factions and defeat Shadow Lords in each area to ensure the immediate safety of each populace, perhaps 1 per faction and maybe a 4th neutral one in the center of the island, with each of the faction ones having set up their lair in some previously inaccessible part of the map, in much the same way that the actual game has 1 area on each island that doesn't unlock until Chapter 3, which are ordinarily part of completing objectives for the Spirit Ritual that you already did on different islands in the previous chapter. So now we're just rearranging the sequence of events to make those restricted areas part of defeating Shadow Lords who have invaded the heart of each faction after Necroloth kidnapped each faction leader. The Shadow Lord in each region can have its own dedicated theme, sort of like how they do in the actual game, with one being the Shadow Lord of Cowardice, another of Betrayal, and so on, that can be thematically related to new side quests in each region. We'll just expand on this idea and make it a stronger narrative than it actually is in the actual game. These new enemies likewise would introduce new changes to the environments, physically altering the maps from the way you got to know them in Chapter 2 by turning them into the new Shadowlands look, while also triggering new side quests from NPCs who are now dealing with these new changes. Kind of like what happens in Chapter 3 of Gothic 2 when you return to the original Corinus map from the Valley of Mines. Maybe some hunters would be struggling to find game now that the minions have taken over their hunting grounds, or a farmland could be under attack, or NPCs in the various faction headquarters could be mentally susceptible to the Shadow Lord's influence over the area, like the Shadow Lord of Betrayal turning a sect of Guardian cadets hostile who are now trying to undermine the magician's control over their crystal magic, and you have to find a way to stop their plans without harming the cadets. Or perhaps the Shadow Lord of Cowardice could be making a bunch of the demon hunters too afraid to defend their citadel or help out the neighboring citizens, and so you have to find a way to restore their confidence and get them back to action. These would of course be part of the main quest and helping to secure the safety of each faction, besides just defeating the Shadow Lords themselves. Actually, defeating the Shadow Lords could be similar to defeating the dragons in Gothic 2, where you have to fight through a hostile series of enemies to reach the Shadow Lord's lair, with each one having opportunities for some kind of special quest assistance from special NPCs you already worked with in Chapter 2. Enemies in the Shadowlands would be just basic ones, like hellhounds and regular melee minions, but these would of course be the most difficult enemies you've encountered in the game thus far, so that the armies of the underworld will actually feel like a dangerous, menacing threat to the world's survival. And since, again, we're following a slightly more linear sequence of island hopping, the game can know at this point exactly how much experience you'll have been able to attain, and thus the highest power rating you could possibly have reached through skill training, to set the stats for these various enemies appropriately. Maybe some of the basic enemies that you already killed in Chapter 2 could have respawned between chapters to keep the world feeling somewhat alive, but it would be relatively limited, and maybe now some of them are the stronger variants you fought in Chapter 3. Other crystal portals will have opened up in a bunch of different areas as well, just to give us a few more areas with shadowlands and shadow creatures throughout the island to keep the difficulty up. But you don't yet know how to close these portals, and so there'll just be road bumps for now that you'll have to come back to later. It's the 4 Shadow Lords that you're primarily interested in defeating. Once you defeat the final Shadow Lord, you're confronted by Necroloth, who reveals his ultimate plan, which is basically that he's going to use the power of the 3 mages to manifest even stronger minions in the physical world that will ravage the seas and sail to all other lands, while also preventing you from reaching his secret lair on another hidden island, while he continues his devious plan to manifest the all-powerful Titan of Death, which might be an amalgamation of all the previously defeated Titans who were sent to the underworld. Their power now merged into one super being capable of harvesting all living souls on the planet and bringing about the end of humanity. He realizes that your soul is more powerful than he originally thought, and vows to let you live a little while longer, teasing that he may possibly have some use for you later. Chapter 4 ends with a cutscene in which you try to attack Necroloth, but he teleports away. Chapter 5 is mostly preparation for the final battle. You have to recruit allied ships to sail the high seas to reach Necroloth's hidden lair, who will help in defeating the armies of darkness, which requires talking to the second in command of each faction to get their support. Each of them insists that they need to close down the portals to the underworld in their respective regions before they can feel safe sending an army away from the island. So there can be a series of new quests to learn about how to shut down the portals before going around the map for each one. Meanwhile, new enemies can be spewing out of the portals between chapters, like tougher types of minions with better weapons and armor, and the even tougher Shadow Guardians, which would represent the new toughest enemies you've encountered in the game thus far. You'd also need to visit the Inquisition and pirate gangs on the islands you visited in Chapter 3 as part of preparing for your spirit ritual, in order to recruit their ships to join the fight as well. Each of them would have a different set of quests, which might involve doing a bunch of tasks to get their ships up and running for battle, kind of like you do with getting Slane's ship ready to set sail in Risen 2, with gathering different types of supplies like water, food, and cannons, and convincing enough crew members to join up with what might possibly be a suicide mission. Sea battles could start triggering during this chapter, as you sail between islands to reinforce that Necroloth's undead minions are actually prowling the high seas for the sake of the story, but they would also serve as relatively low-stakes tutorials for how some of these new systems work before you get to the climax of this chapter, which will utilize everything you've learned in a much more difficult scenario. We'll just keep these ones fairly simple and won't do too many of them so it doesn't spoil the final showdown. Once you've got your armada of ships ready for battle, you can set out for the final sea battle, which is expanded into a much more elaborate sequence that combines elements from the different sea battles you've experienced previously in multiple progressive stages, like fighting a giant sea monster, firing cannons at enemy ghost ships, boarding their vessels, fighting minions in hand-to-hand combat, and defeating some type of boss-like enemy. Maybe now we see Captain Crow for the first time, and he teases that Necroloth is bringing back evil spirits from the underworld, and that Garcia, Slane, and Mara could be wreaking havoc elsewhere in the world. Just give the whole sequence a heavy dose of emphasis on the production value with cinematic cutscenes to set the stage for each phase of the fight, and make the other ships you recruited actually participate in some crucial way during the cutscenes, or by having them available as NPCs who will literally help you defeat sea monsters and board enemy ships. After defeating Necroloth's Legion at sea, you learn the precise coordinates of his hidden lair and continue your voyage into Chapter 6. Chapter 6 introduces you to a brand new island that serves as the final dungeon, and which houses the toughest enemies you've yet to encounter in the game, like those flying worm demon things, magic-casting minions, and beefed-up Shadow Lords. It can basically be Skull Island exactly as it is in the actual game, with the same main goal of rescuing the three mages who are all imprisoned in different areas of the island, except maybe the island is just a little bit smaller and with more of an actual dungeon environment to navigate before reaching the final boss battle with Necroloth. It turns out the mages' powers have already been mostly drained to fuel Necroloth's sinister plans, but once rescued, they each vow to have one last push they can give to help you defeat the Titan of Death and bind Necroloth's soul to the Skull Staff, using the catalyst you already obtained in Chapter 3 for your own spirit ritual. After rescuing all three mages, you enter Necroloth's lair. At this point of the actual game, you basically just walk right into the final boss battle, but here I'd like to expand it a little bit with some more puzzle solving and platforming gameplay as you navigate your way to Necroloth's inner sanctum, where each of your recruited party members has a chance to help out in some way similar to Gothic 2. Maybe Jafar helps you bypass a puzzle mechanism with some kind of special dinghy he already has in his possession, Edward can help you battle a difficult enemy, Sadat can help you see special items needed for another puzzle, Patty can help you operate a series of switches and levers that need two people, and so on. This way it feels like your party members are actually contributing to saving the world instead of just standing around the harbor doing literally nothing the whole time, as are depicted in both the preceding gameplay and in the ending cutscene. If this is too much extra content to add to the game, then we can cut some or all of the faction crew member side quests from the coast where you first land to make more room in the budget for this new final dungeon. Once you reach Necroloth's inner sanctum, you encounter him standing before a crystal portal, where he congratulates you for your tenacity and tries to tempt you into joining his side by offering to make you a Titan Lord and giving you personal control over the Titan of Death, who then emerges from the portal. You reject his offer with role-playing choices that reflect the karma meter in some way to explain your reasoning. Positive being that you want to ensure the safety of humanity, negative that you don't need Necroloth's offer to achieve your true power, and so on, which will impact which ending you ultimately get. He laughs and says you're welcome to try defeating the Titan on your own. Then you face the final boss alone, which in this case will be the Titan of Death, but the mages have shown up to offer the last of their support provided you can do a thing to assist them in channeling their energy. The fight can be a remixed version of the reactor golem from Tyrannus, basically taking that boss fight and moving it here, with needing to throw magical bindings onto the golem and manually connecting different nodes across the arena, like forming a power grid in a pentagram shape while dodging enemy attacks, which defeats the Titan. Necroloth expresses his displeasure and does the same transformation he does in the actual game and becoming a stronger version of a Shadow Lord where you fight Necroloth directly. This can play out largely like the actual boss fight where he teleports around the map to heal and you have to chase him down while avoiding or battling extra summons to defeat him in raw combat. Except I'd like to make it just a little more complicated in some way, like if you had to actually use the portals to track Necroloth through different areas instead of them just being a convenient shortcut, or if the level design could progressively collapse so you have to take more circuitous routes and jump over gaps to reach different areas of the arena, thus giving him potentially more time to heal. Once you defeat Necroloth, the mages step in and pin him down, allowing you to perform the same ritual Patty did in Chapter 1 to bind your soul to the Skull Staff, using the power of the mages and the catalyst you acquired in Chapter 3. Except this time it's Necroloth's soul you're transposing into the staff. The ritual succeeds and you carry the Skull Staff with you back to your ship, stopping to talk with your crew and other important characters along the way, who each have something important to say about the situation that teases what might be in store for their future, and for other aspects of the world they preside over in the case of the faction leaders. At the end, you meet with Patty at the helm of your ship and say something endearing to each other, with this final bit of dialogue and subsequent cutscene being influenced by your soul rating, which might imply slightly different outcomes for you and Patty or the rest of humanity based on what you do with the Skull Staff. The positive ending would be to break the Skull Staff then and there to ensure Necroloth can never return and the power of the Titans can never be let loose on the world again. The neutral ending would be to throw the Skull Staff in the ocean where it could potentially be found later on, but at least it's out of dangerous hands for the time being. And the negative ending would be to keep the Skull Staff and use Necroloth's power for yourself. Either way, you get an appropriate reaction from Patty, who vows to stay by your side on this new adventure, where you either continue on as lovers in a positive ending, or as platonic friends in a neutral ending, or as partners in crime in a negative ending. Then we get to watch the ship sail off into the sunset as the credits start to roll, thus bringing the game to its final conclusion. And so that's my mock-up for how to fix Risen 3. These changes would bring the game closer in line to the formula used for Gothic 2, which is widely considered to be their gold standard for gameplay design. Although I'm somewhat averse to the concept of just rehashing the same thing over and over again, the truth is we really hadn't seen another PB game like Gothic 2 since Gothic 2, with 2 of their 3 subsequent games being radical departures from that formula, and one being more of a scaled-back, simplified take on Gothic 1. So I think in this case it may have been a more than appropriate time to invoke some of that Gothic 2 design philosophy to sate a taste their audience had been craving for over a decade, and to prove that they still have a firm grasp of what it is about their games that people liked originally. At the very least, the structure would help a lot with giving us a plot that actually feels like a proper continuation from Risen 2, more interesting characterization up front between the main character and Patty, a more compelling antagonist who's actually present from the beginning of the game, more of a concrete goal you're striving to accomplish at each step of the main quest, more twists in the story as you advance through the chapters, more dynamic gameplay with exciting changes to experience in each chapter with new islands and new changes happening to familiar islands, a more satisfying difficulty curve that ramps the difficulty up and keeps you challenged throughout the entire game without resorting to level scaling enemies, and a more satisfying conclusion that implies lasting consequences for the future and that brings the character relationship full circle between the main character and Patty. The bulk of these changes simply involve rearranging existing content into different sections of the game and writing different dialogue and cutscenes to accommodate the changes, so it seems like these would have been relatively easy changes to make if they were just part of the design from the beginning. The hardest changes would just be ironing out a brand new set of enemy and weapon stats to suit the more linear progression system, scripting up a bunch of new quest lines, and developing a few more elaborate dungeon environments. That might ultimately be more total work involved than what they already put into the game originally, so maybe this isn't really a practical solution. But I still feel like there's room in the budget to afford this extra work if they were to just cut out some of the extraneous content, like just not having so many shallow side quests and making some of the maps a little bit smaller to compensate. Bear in mind that this is just an extremely rough draft of a concept that I've been brainstorming, and there are a lot more issues with Risen 3 that could stand to be fixed than what I've addressed here. My goal was simply to find a way to improve the game while keeping as much of it the same as possible, to avoid having to completely recreate so many things from scratch. I don't profess to be a professional game designer, and I'm not an expert on the subject matter, so there may very well be better alternatives than what I've come up with here, and maybe I'm injecting too much of my own personal taste in the matter. Maybe Risen 3 is perfectly fine as is and doesn't need any major changes whatsoever, or maybe it's completely beyond salvaging and no amount of changes will ever make it truly good. Regardless, I'd be interested to hear other opinions on the matter. Would these types of changes that I've outlined actually improve the game in your opinion, or else are there other changes that you feel would help the game even more? Let me know what you think in the comments, and as usual, if you've enjoyed this video then be sure to like, subscribe, and share the video in the process.